Starting. And I'm back. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to episode 8 of Freedom Alternative Interviews. I'm here again with Professor Janice Fiamengo from the English Department of the University of Ottawa. As most of you already know, Professor Fiamengo is the host of the series Fiamengo File, hosted over at Studio Brule, and links for that are in the low bar. So without further ado, Professor Fiamengo, welcome back to Freedom Alternative Interviews.
Thank you for interviewing me again.
All right, let's get straight into business. You recently launched a call for submissions of stories to be included in a future book of yours. Provisional title, if I remember correctly, is Sons of Feminism. Please do tell us more about this new project of yours.
Yeah, well, I got the idea as a result of the many emails that I've received from men after I gave my first talk at the University of Toronto 3 years ago. And, these stories ranged from horrific accounts of being kicked out of university because, in one example, 2 young women complained that this man had been staring at them in some administrative office. He doesn't recall, even the incident in question, and he was ultimately told when his expulsion was upheld, he was ultimately told that he had an intense gaze, and that this made women uncomfortable.
Sorry for
interrupting.
What does that even mean? What's an intense gaze? Serious question. I have no idea what that means. I don't understand the term.
I have no idea what it means either. It really is quite Orwellian. And another, all sorts of men talked about horrific divorce stories, about losing contact with their children, about an ex-wife who lied about the threat that they supposedly posed and alienated their children from them, and were unhesitatingly believed by the courts. And you know the kinds of stories, of course, and I'm sure people listening to you aren't surprised to hear that I heard those stories. And eventually I just thought that they weren't really just for me, that more people, these stories really need to be made available to people. And so that's when I got the idea for the book. And I would just like the possibility of reaching some readers who still believe that the feminist movement is a movement about equal rights for women, and that it is a benign social movement that has good effects for both men and women. And I want to show what it looks like from the other side, in the hopes that somebody might be interested in having their eyes opened, especially women, I guess. But there are a lot of men out there who are not very interested in the malign impact of feminism either, and I'd like them to have an opportunity to read about these stories. Often I think in cases like this, if one is not personally impacted, one doesn't really believe that the general reports one is hearing are true. And therefore, I'd like people to have the opportunity to read a number of personal accounts.
Do you think personal accounts can be effective? I don't know. I'm not trying to use a social justice warrior type of language, but as far as I'm concerned, personal accounts are interesting, but they don't impact me. What impacts me is data. But I guess I'm not the target audience.
Yeah, well, I agree that only personal accounts, that would be insufficient. But it does seem to me that some people are touched, especially women perhaps, through the heart. So I'm hoping that some of these stories might matter to women who have sons that they care about, or brothers, or boyfriends, and that they might be moved then to investigate, to find out whether there is a reality behind these personal accounts. Often with feminist stories about women's victimization, the story stands on its own and nobody investigates. We simply believe the woman, In this case, I will write an introduction in which I don't ask people to necessarily believe that each story is necessarily absolutely representative of all boys or men, but I would ask my readers if they're appalled by what they read to investigate and to find out whether, in fact, the stories that are being recounted do represent a large number of men in Western societies.
I see. Now, you mentioned that the target audience is, ordinary people, especially women who drink the Kool-Aid of feminism, passively or actively. Now, do you think that these kinds of stories, not only that they can work, but they can turn hearts and minds towards sanity and away from insanity? And the reason I'm asking this is because women have been made, and I'm sorry to put it this way, but women have been made aware multiple times about the ills of feminism and continue to be, even by mainstream media outlets. I mean, The Telegraph is now publishing anti-feminist stories and things of that nature. Yet my impression is that the overwhelming majority of women simply, I don't know, they simply don't give a fuck. Am I looking at this the wrong way, or maybe you're a bit more optimistic than I am?
I'm about as non-optimistic as it's possible to be. I have these conversations with friends in the men's advocacy movement all the time, and many of them are more hopeful than I am. As a woman, I have been inside the feminist movement, and I've had many conversations with pro-feminist women, and I have to say that my impression isn't that different from yours. I'm so tired of hearing women saying, well, my feminism isn't like that, and I feel like saying, well, your feminism has been utterly, hopelessly useless over the last 40 years then. If it is genuinely about equality, why isn't it having an impact? Why isn't it standing up for all of these abused men? But anyway, I think there's a difference between my personal gut feeling and what I'm trying to do in this book, which is to move forward as if this is a strategy that might work and hope that it does. One never knows, one simply makes the stories available, one speaks, one makes one's argument, even feeling that it's unlikely to be effective. I think there is something to be said about the cathartic impact of men being able to tell their stories, and of men realizing through reading a book like this that they're not alone either, that they're not crazy, they're not the only ones who have been made to feel hated by their society as a result of 40 years of feminist enculturation. So that too might have a positive impact. But no, I can't say I'm optimistic or even particularly hopeful, but I'm a little bit hopeful, I guess.
I see. Now, a quick question. Why do you think most individuals don't give a fuck, and particularly most women? Because, when talking with what many say that it's derogatory to call, yet I still call them manginas, because it would be better to call them manginas instead of cucks. But, when I talk with manginas, eventually, if you try hard enough, you get them to at least understand your point of view, even if they end up still disagreeing. But when talking with feminist women, they don't seem to be able even to grasp the opposite point of view. Not necessarily to agree, but just to understand where does the opposite point of view coming from.
Yes, I know. Well, and I don't know why. Many people have advanced various explanations or various metaphors. Anyway, some people speak of feminism as a kind of virus that actually prevents rational understanding or empathy for the other point of view. My friend Steve and I were speaking just recently about feminism as a kind of mass hysteria that might be compared to other episodes of mass hysteria throughout history, in which people believe something that is demonstrably not true and yet believe and act as if it is, in the absence of any compelling evidence. I've also argued, as you probably know, in one of my videos, that perhaps feminism is a kind of mental disorder of some sort. I've heard people talk about narcissism or victim mentality, Munchausen. Some have advanced that idea. So yeah, I really don't understand, except to say, and I'm kind of repeating myself, I think that it is extremely pleasurable to believe oneself a victim and therefore somehow pure, and in our culture somehow morally superior and deserving of special attention and special belief and respect. So to give that up and to recognize that not only is that a lie personally, but that it's a culture-wide lie, and it's had incredibly damaging effects on the sex that has been regarded as the privileged oppressor. A lot of women are extremely reluctant to do that for the most selfish of reasons. And I haven't been the first one to advance this argument that women, even in the old patriarchal society, have always been the sex that was most privileged, most valued, most cared about. Even patriarchal societies have prized women and valued women's lives and worried about harms to women much more than to men. So the fact that women have accepted that and believe that they're deserving of such a position, I guess isn't that surprising. And so to have to give that up is something most people are reluctant to do. Most women are reluctant to do.
Mm-hmm. Now that you mentioned the privileged oppressed narrative, which we'll come back to in a moment, I guess this provides a very good transition towards the latest quote unquote underprivileged group, and the underprivileged hysteria that is polluting several societies. You know, we both see things relatively similar, that feminism may or may not be a mental disorder, but is definitely an ideology and a facet of a larger ideology, or better said, a larger problem. Now, you, the academics types, you call it, deconstructionalist postmodernism or critical pedagogy. Those of us outside of the academia, we just stick with the original terminology, cultural Marxism. But regardless of how the problem is called, it still exists and affects normal people trying to live their lives. Because if this had been only just, an ideology that individuals subscribed, in their personal lives, for instance, affecting the dating game and things of that nature, that would have been a much smaller problem than when this exact same issue creeps into legislation. For instance, yesterday I recorded a video about Canada's latest attempt to shrink the legal corridor of opinion even further. Hopefully, I'll get to edit that one today and also publish it on the channel. You've seen the story, I tagged you on Facebook. But for the audience who haven't seen the story, basically, if Canada's Minister of Justice, Mrs. Jody Wilson-Raybould, anyway, if she has her way, me disagreeing that Bruce Jenner is a woman could get me thrown in jail for up to 2 years, should I ever make the mistake of living in Canada, of course. Now, how's that making any sense? I mean, even from a traditionally liberal slash leftist point of view, that's going a bit too far, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I look forward to that video very much, Lucian. This is, it's, what can one say? It's terrifying. And I would think that most reasonable people, even, as you say, leftists, progressivists, however they want to call themselves, would agree. But I think we are now in a cultural climate where many seemingly reasonable people believe that it is right and justified to silence any speech that might harm someone perceived as vulnerable. And you're right, we're living in this culture that accepts the binary logic of the oppressor and the oppressed. And anyone who can be seen to fall into that oppressed category is considered worthy of these special protective measures. And if that means that certain people simply are punished very harshly in the case of a 2-year jail sentence, I mean, it's unbelievable. Presumably that would be for a repeat offense, but that doesn't make you feel much better. If you actually buy into that idea that it's necessary for people to be shut up in order to protect others, and that words can be that harmful that they destroy people's lives, and in a sense, they do, except that is the cost one accepts for living in a free society. One accepts that words can be very harmful, and that one has to be strong enough to respond to those words. I remember I had a professor in graduate school, and this would be back in the early 1990s, and often he was a very strong social justice warrior, and often students in the class would say, you know, this is really creating a situation, this climate of name calling and accusation. Anytime anyone says anything that is politically incorrect, we're told that we are harming people, whether it's women or homosexuals or the transgendered. And he would say, well, maybe they would say, you know, this makes us feel very uncomfortable about speaking in class and about testing our ideas and engaging in honest exchange. And he would say, well, you know, that's sort of unfortunate, but he saw that as actually really quite beneficial, that privileged people, and he did believe that large swaths of people had some kind of special privilege, unearned, that it was good for them, that it was salutary for them to have to silence themselves, because presumably they'd been able to, you know, for centuries, these individuals had been speaking their minds and harming others. So it was good if for a period of some years they were silenced. And even I'm not sure if he would agree now. I just met him recently at a conference. He's still teaching, and I'm not sure if he would agree that jail terms are actually appropriate. But I know that most academics certainly are happy with the direction that the Trudeau government is moving in. And so I don't know if they would, you know, if those people would see that a step too far. But of course, this has been going on in Canada for years, and almost nobody says a peep about it. In 2013, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld the hate speech conviction of a small town pastor whose crime was to distribute a number of leaflets speaking in strong and colorful language about what he saw as the homosexual agenda in the primary schools. And this was complained about not even by someone who identified as homosexual, but by a third party who was offended. So there was no actual, you know, victim in this hate crime, no victim that came forward, simply someone who was outraged to have one of these leaflets put on his car windshield. And so he complained to the, now I'm forgetting whether it's the Alberta Human Rights Tribunal or the Saskatchewan. It was one of the two, I used to know. And, you know, and it went all the way, he appealed it all the way to the Supreme Court, but he was convicted of hate speech. And the argument, I would encourage anybody who cares, especially Canadians, but anyone who cares about this issue, because it's coming, you know, to a country near you, to read the decision. It's called the Whatcott case, Whatcott. Bill Whatcott was his name, in 2013. I think it's the Alberta Human Rights Tribunal. The argument is so crazy, you know, that you don't have to prove that there is harm done. You simply have to decide, a reasonable person, and all these Supreme Court justices have to decide that there is a likelihood that the speech will cause harm to an identified individual or group, a member of a protected category. And I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all, because obviously to shut people up and to force them to watch what they say could certainly be argued to increase hatred, paranoia, a desire for vengeance against these protected groups. I would say that that would be a far worse route to go if you're trying to prevent people from hating, as if you could ever do that anyway. But if that's what you're trying to do, penalizing people for expressing their opinions in good faith is not the way to prevent hatred. But, you know, this is the
rather
reasoning.
to amplify it. Yeah, Milo Yiannopoulos, he recently said something like that. He said that when he sees the LGBTist lobby going after, you know, rural people who don't want to bake gay wedding cakes and things of that nature,
Yes.
You know, he said that it makes me want to go bash queers in the streets. And I mean, imagine how those people feel about that. As for the actual harm, I'm thinking now, how is Bruce Jenner harmed if I say on my YouTube channel that he's not a woman? I mean, how
Mhm.
someone can maybe can explain to me how is that individual harmed? I mean, is going to lose his millions upon millions in net worth? Is going to lose, his contracts and everything else that makes him, a significantly influential and rich person? How is he going to be harmed if I disagree that he's a woman?
Well, obviously not. Although, I mean, I would make the case that if I look at things from the other side, I've argued that young men are harmed when they have to take sexual assault prevention workshops at university, to have everyone in your culture telling you that simply by the fact of being male, you need to be taught not to rape. Obviously that does a kind of serious harm. And so I can see at some level the kind of argument that is being made, although your point that individuals saying things is very different from authorities in one's culture saying things and having the institutional clout to back the censure and actual punishment. It's quite a different thing. But at some level, I agree that yes, it can be hurtful to have someone say that your identity is false, or whatever, or what have you, or that women are not good at math, or are likely to be ultimately less successful in the technical, engineering, and hard science fields, or whatever it happens to be, or doing IQ tests that prove that there are racial differences in IQ. I can see how all those things are harmful both at an individual and even arguably a social level. But again, that's the cost of living in a free society. The alternatives are much worse. It's the cost of being human, living in mixed societies and arguing about these kinds of things. So yes, in the transgender case, it's actually really quite astounding to see how quickly we've gone from regarding transgenderism as something that affects only a tiny, tiny percentage of the population, and quite likely a kind of body dysmorphia that should be treated as a problem to be healed. We've moved from that in I don't know how many short years to saying that this is a culturally sanctioned identity that must not ever be disagreed with. It's quite startling. And one does wonder, of course, whether in 50 years or 100 years, if there is still a civilization that would look back on the past and care about such things, whether this will be seen as another form of this sort of social justice madness, and a particularly devastating one for the reasons I think you wanted to bring up about the treatment of children,
Yeah, because
parents.
that's my biggest problem
Yeah,
when
go ahead.
they bring children into this, because at the end of the day I'm still a libertarian. So if you want to change your body to fit whatever your imagination says or whatnot, it's not really my business, provided that it's not paid by the taxpayers and provided that
Mhm.
it's done by consenting adults.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, let's
Yes.
go full politically incorrect and drive a bit further into this transgender business. Because, we
Hmm.
discussed earlier how feminism harms men and feminism harms children by destroying their families. The political
Yeah.
correctness of the tranny lobby harms confused children. Now, I've sent you a while ago, probably right after our first interview, a story published by the NY magazine with the fight over so-called transgender children. I can't believe this is a culturally acceptable term. Anyway, there was a fight that led to the fire of Dr. Kenneth Zucker, a respected researcher in this area of sexually confused children and whatnot. He used to lead the Child, Youth, and Family Gender Identity Clinic in Toronto, in your backyard, in Canada. And his
Hmm.
crime was that he adopted a more let's wait and see mentality. He tried to help kids understand themselves first, rather than rushing into filling them with hormones and whatnot. But the political trend has been infecting science lately, and the recommended treatment is gender affirming care, which is jargon for if a 5-year-old girl says she's a boy, therefore she is a boy. End of story. Now, these kinds of cases are getting more are occurring more often than they did in 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Why? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with you. It seems to me obviously a terrible mistake to be giving hormone treatments to children, to be encouraging them to believe themselves to have a different gender identity from what their body clearly is. I mean, the whole rationale of the transgender ideology is so strange in the sense that I mean it requires, you know, we're in this supposedly secular society that doesn't believe that if somebody says, you know, God spoke to me, most of us are inclined to be rather wary about, even people who are religiously inclined are wary about accepting an individual statement that they, you know, a voice has come to them and told them to do something, and this is God's voice. This is almost like that, except that it's somebody saying, I know that inside, you know, I'm a woman, as it seems often to be, a woman trapped in a man's body more than the other way around, although of course there are the other cases as well. But you know, to accept that, I mean, what a remarkable leap of faith that we're now all being asked to engage in. And as you say, if that's what somebody wants to do to their body, an adult, okay, but for the entire society to conspire in furthering that, believing it, it's truly bizarre. And there's an article, I don't know if you saw it, I posted it on my Facebook just maybe a week ago, by a fellow named Daniel Harris. It was published in the Antioch Review and immediately protested, leading the editors to publish a lengthy apology for it. This is by a man, if I know him, if I'm remembering correctly, identifies as a gay man who has also worked as a transvestite. Mm-hmm. And he talks about the transgender industry, the ideology, the movement, and the particular contradictions of it. One of the points he makes is that it's really bizarre. Like it operates according to this weird binary that supposedly the post-structuralist, feminist, postmodern movement is all against. But it operates according to this binary whereby you cannot disidentify in any way with your gender now. There's no such thing as androgyny or, you know, a feminine man. You can't be that. You either are a man, or if you feel that you are a man but you have a woman's body, then you must really be a man or a woman. So it's reimposing this strange kind of absolute binary at a time when supposedly the binary is over. And he says, even if we accept what transgender people say, that I'm a woman, even though I have a man's body, why is the man's body less important than the womanly identity that is inside and invisible? Why doesn't the body count for anything at all? And he also says that even if we accept it's true, why would it be enough to cut off a penis and replace it with a vagina? Every other part of the body is still male. Why would that fool the woman inside if it's really a woman inside? The hands are still a man's hands. The face is still a man's face. The chest is still a man's face, even if you put breasts on it. And you know, so that inner woman is always going to be unhappy. That inner woman is not so stupid not to recognize that the feet are a man's feet. So is the entire body, including the organs and the cells and everything, to be changed in accordance with this inner conviction? Why would it be sufficient to make the kinds of changes that are being made now? I mean, it really is a movement destined to create extremely unhappy people, and the suicide rates and everything else certainly suggest that that's the case. Of course, I guess you could say, well, that's because of societal, you know, lack of acceptance or whatever, but it doesn't seem that that's the case.
Yeah, well, since you mentioned the suicide rates, maybe I should remind the audience of something. You know, post-operative transgenders have the exact same suicide rates in the Netherlands as they do in Iran, in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And it's not a coincidence that I'm bringing up Iran, because in Iran, so-called, what's called sex reassignment surgery is actually paid for by the taxpayers in Iran. It's paid by the Islamic State, I'm not joking. And
Mhm.
transgenderism or transsexualism is remarkably acceptable. And as you pointed out by quoting that particular author, it's precisely in this binary form. I mean, effeminate gay men are encouraged to transition into female
Mhm.
because being an effeminate gay man is not really acceptable in Iran. But claiming to be a woman trapped in a man's body, that's perfectly acceptable. And there's even Islamic scholars who argue for that. So it seems to me that we're adopting. I mean, the leftists will try to convince me that this is progress, but to me, it looks like looking backwards. Uh, it's
Mhm.
more in
Yeah.
line with the 7th century type of scholarship than with the 21st century because it's the current year type of scholarship.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and certainly that's part of Daniel Harris's argument that actually this is homophobia disguised as some kind of gender enlightenment, and so that's another element of the cultural mix there. But to get back to your original question about children, yes, this is appalling that that there is this move to encourage children at a young age to see themselves as transgender, and I don't know how you can look at that as anything other than a really bizarre 21st century form of child abuse.
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
just
they put
appalling.
very confused boys on a medicine called Lepron, which is a prostate cancer drug that causes irreversible injuries because it was designed to treat prostate cancer in older men, as opposed to now it's being used to block the puberty of otherwise physically healthy 12, 13-year-old boys. I mean, no matter how liberal we may want to be with this whole tranny thing, there's real children being harmed out there, and we're not even allowed to discuss why we're doing that because
Mm.
some tranny dykes' feelings might be hurt.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's I don't think people have thought this through. I was particularly surprised to read in an article about the liberal bill, to outlaw any hateful discussion of transgenderism, that even the Conservative Party is looking as if it's going to get on board with the legislation. So quickly, the entire political landscape is moving to criminalize honest discussion of this issue that has potentially devastating consequences for children. I don't know what more to say about it.
Yeah,
It's frightening.
yeah, we're getting labeled as haters when in reality most of the individuals opposing to this tranny ideology, they're making an argument of compassion. I mean, I don't want
Hmm.
12-year-old boys having to be shoved down their throats medicine or products that are
Yeah.
designed to treat prostate cancer in 60-year-old men. There's a reason we have medicines for different stages of life. There is a reason
Hmm.
we have all these kinds of things that have developed quite naturally over the progress of science. So I guess the final question on this particular topic, and then we'll get to further controversies, of course. Where does this end? Where do you see the end game? You mentioned earlier that maybe 50 years later, on in 2060, we're gonna look back on this and say, "Oh my God, how stupid we are." Is that how you think? How you feel things will evolve?
Well, I don't know if there will be a society like ours in 50 years or 100 years to look back and say that, because it does seem to me this is a kind of, this must be an expression of some sort of absolute cultural decadence of a culture that really can't imagine a future for itself, a culture that has decided to deny the natural, and to deny biology, to deny the body to such an extent that it imagines that simply by willing something we can make reality conform to our whatever desires we happen to have. And I don't know, I mean, this seems I can only see this as sort of the death throes of a civilization that really can't imagine a future for itself.
Yeah, well, we do imagine a future where children essentially lead us because, as you said, there is a significant chunk of the culture that genuinely believes that words alone can shape reality. Now, I used to believe that, but I have an excuse. I was 4 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it really does seem that we're being led by children, basically. I mean, this is a particularly childish mentality.
Yeah. Yeah, and a society that operates according to such magical thinking, which, as you say, it's a delightful aspect of childhood, and but one is expected to grow out of it, and a society that refuses to grow out of it, and then in fact, quite rigorously punishes anybody who tries to offer a more reality-based point of view, is surely a society that just can't keep functioning in any kind of healthy way. And ultimately, it does seem to be, I mean, there's all sorts of issues involved, and I don't want to keep bringing it back to just feminism and the attack on men, but it does ultimately seem to be an attack on maleness and on masculinity as rationality, as logic, as science-based thinking and deduction. That these are the primary targets of hatred, and when even politicians and lawmakers are quite willing to punish people simply for saying the truth. This is happening in other areas too. Of course, the new president of my university is the former head of the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal, and his big issue is criminalizing the criticism of Islam, any discussion of Islam that is seen to be irreverent or insulting. And, so he's going to be he is, I guess now, the new president of the University of Ottawa. And I never thought I would live to see the day when somebody who, an actual a punisher of blasphemers would become the head of a major Canadian university. And so yeah, the attack on truth telling as something that is legitimately to be suppressed and punished is surely the sign. What clearer sign could there be of a civilization that doesn't believe in its own founding principles and wants to go into the night?
Yeah, as much as I don't like these kinds of grim predictions, it does seem in many cases that at least a portion of the European slash North American civilization doesn't seem to believe in itself, doesn't seem to want to exist anymore. Now, let's move to another controversy. Last time you were on the show, we did talk about Donald Trump. Of course, we did. Everyone talks about Donald Trump because Daddy is great. That's just joking. Anyway, since then, things have progressed quite a bit, with Trump saying at one point that women have it far better than men, or something to that effect. A statement which, of course...
Yeah, big deal. Oh, no.
Oh, my God, how dare he said that? Of course, the progressivist establishment went full Macintosh over it. Now, with that being said, we can agree that Trump is at least in part correct, if not entirely correct. But do you think Donald Trump is legitimately an anti-feminist, or at the very least, a non-feminist, a person who doesn't buy into the feminist narrative, doesn't drink the Kool-Aid?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert on Trump. I haven't followed, all of his statements, so I'm not sure. But it does seem to me that in his total lack of interest in political correctness, to that extent, certainly, he is anti-feminist, social justice, political correctness, and everything that we despise. So I find him refreshing on those grounds, certainly. Sometimes I wish he would be much more careful and measured in his arguments, and I'd like to see somebody who spoke a bit better than he does in some cases. But that very willingness to simply say whatever, to be unafraid, I think is wonderful, and I welcome it. I don't know, I'm not sure where he stands in terms of feminism. As many men's advocates have argued, it isn't just feminism that overvalues women and undervalues men. It's our whole society. It's been like that. It's been gynocentric in that way in different forms for centuries. And so just because somebody does not declare himself a feminist doesn't mean that he doesn't believe in all sorts of ways that women deserve special protections and special status in our society, and that equality, only matters when it helps women, and that it shouldn't be pursued if it in any way harms women. I don't really have no idea where he stands on those kinds of things. I don't know if he's even aware of these kinds of debates, or has made very many statements about them. But certainly, if I had to choose, if I were in a position where I could choose between Trump and either Hillary or Bernie, I would definitely take Trump, because I think he is somebody who is prepared to stand against political correctness, and that's just incredibly important right now.
Yeah, the more intellectual supporters of Trump usually tend to argue in this fashion, namely that very few people will vote for Trump for his policies. The overwhelming majority of people who will vote for Trump in the general elections, of course, assuming he gets the nomination, will be people who are just sick and tired of this political correctness, of this slimy ideology, this censorious climate. I mean, even the intellectuals who do support him don't really believe in his policies, or may even absolutely despise his policies. Yet, nonetheless, they support him as a force against political correctness.
I'm not sure I would put myself in that camp, actually. I have to say, I just don't know well enough to be able to say. But I would say the little I do know about his policies, actually, they seem to me quite sound. And people always come forward, the people I respect, and say, he doesn't have any policies. It seems to me he does have a lot, and they make a lot of sense. He's talking about strengthening America's position economically. He talked about building the wall that everyone howls about. It seems to me actually quite necessary to halt the influx of illegal immigration. He's talked about a moratorium on Muslim immigration. That seems to me, perfectly reasonable in light of, yeah, I mean, so these, he's talking about strengthening America's national security, strengthening its military position. All of these things seem to me no-brainers, really. I guess, obviously, what matters is how one can go about doing all these things. I don't know if he specifically talked about the massive, whatever it is now, $20 trillion debt. I mean, that seems to be, that's probably the most pressing issue facing America and the whole world right now. I don't know what he has to say about how he would tackle that. It seems almost, insurmountable at this problem. So at this point, but so in general, I actually have to say that as far as I know them, his policies seem to me really quite reasonable. I'd like him to articulate his policies. I'd like a presidential candidate to have a little bit of presidential gravitas. It doesn't mean he has to be stiff, and certainly I don't want him to be politically correct. I just don't like the sort of, the crudeness and the flying off at the mouth. I know that a lot of people find that refreshing, but I think you can oppose political correctness without, I don't know, without obscenities and that kind of thing. But anyway, so generally I like his policies as far as I know them. I just don't put myself forward as somebody who is to be taken very seriously on his policies, because I don't know them.
Yeah, our betters, our moral superiors on the left try to say, oh my God, building a wall is so savage, is not going to work. Well, here in this part of Europe, our neighbors in Bulgaria built a wall, and believe it or not, it works. Our neighbors in Hungary built a wall, and believe it or not, it works. Even Macedonia built a wall, and believe it or not, it works. Of course, it's not really a wall. It's more like a barb razor fence, but nevertheless, it strengthened the borders, and believe it or not, it works. I mean, you no longer see those long columns that were noticeable exactly 1 year ago of quote-unquote refugees. It just no longer happens. It's amazing how many miracles can a barbed razor fence and a few soldiers actually guarding the border can do. So if that worked here in a significantly poorer area of the world, why wouldn't it work in a significantly richer area of the world? I mean, it doesn't have to be a wall, 3 meters high and whatnot, but why wouldn't it work to actually start protecting the border? I mean, a country only exists as long as it has a border, doesn't it?
Mhm. Yes, I mean, the idea that somehow to try to protect one's borders, to believe in national sovereignty, and to believe in the necessity of preventing floods of illegals from coming into one's country, the idea that that is somehow bigoted or beyond the pale or racist, I find it bizarre. Again, only a country that wishes to die could generally come to believe that protecting itself against illegal immigration is a bad thing. Um, you know, only a country that didn't want to survive could possibly come to believe that that was a bad thing. So, yeah. Again, I listen to the arguments of the opposition, but they don't make any sense to me, and they seem to consist mostly of virtue signaling and cries of horror by people who, because of their economic position in society, can mostly avoid the consequences of the things that ordinary people are worried about. If you live in a wonderful gated community and
Mhm.
your life is protected, of course, then you can be horrified at the bigotry of others. But
Yeah, because
yeah,
you know
it's ordinary people's creative rights.
the most diversity loving individuals seem to be living
Hmm.
in the most non-diverse gated communities
Yeah.
possible, whereas
Hmm.
the people who
Yeah.
actually do face the consequences of diversity tend to adopt a rather conservative, or maybe I should say rather commonsensical position, because I don't think it's
Hmm.
liberal or
Yeah.
conservative to want to have an actual border. Now,
No.
because you mentioned the economic position and the privileges of our opposition. I mean, we've been going on for what, 46, 47 minutes, 45, whatever, and we haven't checked our privileges, Professor.
Mhm, yes. Mhm. Yeah. Well, okay, I'll check my privilege. I have come increasingly to feel that as a woman, I am privileged and I am protected, that I can get away with saying things that a man in my position would have already been hauled in to speak to the dean of arts at my university or even to the president of the university about the terribly misogynist things I was saying. And so, yeah, I do have privilege that way. The idea that men in general have some, white men in particular, have some kind of general privilege just has come to me to seem more and more bizarre and obscene. And yeah, I agree that there are some probably, alpha men out there who can get away with a lot of stuff. More and more, it does seem to me that all of the, the demonizing, the stigmatizing of male sexuality, all of the prohibitions on whether men can stare at a woman, or ask her out on a date without being hauled before some tribunal for sexual harassment. It seems to me more and more that that is about a stratification amongst those very privileged men who happen to be incredibly sexually powerful and attractive. They can get away with a lot of stuff, probably. Women don't tend to complain about them. Women complain about men that they regard as creepy, or that they don't personally find attractive. Those men are not allowed to approach them in any way without being slapped with some kind of complaint. And to pretend, therefore, the privilege still applies to those men who have to watch every move they make, every word they say, they have to watch where their gaze happens to travel in a room. It's just ludicrous. And it really is like the contempt that our elite culture expresses for basic male sexual feelings. That's what it often seems to come down to. I mean, it's really, again, the war on biology. Men feel these things. Men do have these strong desires. I mean, I'm going on the basis of what people have written me, obviously, and my personal understanding of men, which is not that extensive. But this idea that it's evil for a man to express, even in a polite way, that he is interested in a woman, to ask her out a number of times on a date, to make jokes, to show in his body language that he finds her attractive. This is now something that you can get fired for or disciplined at your workplace or at your university. What? So are we a society that no longer wants to reproduce? Again, it all seems to come back to a kind of cultural death wish. And I know maybe that's an exaggeration, but it just strikes me that we have completely turned against nature. So that's my privilege as a woman. I can say all these things, and the worst thing that'll happen is that somebody says I'm a self-hater, a self-hating woman, or whatever. I have internalized misogyny, whatever it happens to be. And just as we were saying earlier about with the prohibitions on speech, I have to say that feminism has made me sort of dislike women generally. The more it goes on, the more I have to read about women's complaints, the more I have to read that yet more measures should be done to encourage women in STEM. The more I read that, women have experienced, that 1 in 4 women has experienced terrible sexual harassment at work. The more I'm exposed to all this stuff, the more ashamed I am to be a woman.
Yeah, and there used to be a time when being called privileged was a compliment. I mean, look, for instance, I have the privilege of speaking several
Of
languages.
course.
The overwhelming majority of the people watching this may never learn them in their entire lives, no matter how much they try, because I have a natural propensity towards learning foreign languages faster than a significant majority of the world populace. That's a privilege, but I
It
have
is.
cultivated it and I worked for it. And it is a privilege that I'm proud of. I don't think I should be ashamed of the fact that I do have certain access to certain cultures and certain information because of things that I worked for. Privilege used to be something that was admired and was aspired to.
Sure. Yeah, achievement was something that that everyone admires, and sure, in some
Used to
cases,
admire.
people do have. And people do have natural talents, and so in that sense, maybe everybody, to a certain extent, who is extremely intelligent or even extremely hardworking, they probably have a hardworking gene that has come down to them because of some whatever, some ancestral trait or whatever it happens to be. You can get into arguing that nothing is really belongs to an individual alone. It's always a mix of what we inherit and what we learn from our parents and all of that. But yeah, it used to be something that one admired. Now it is supposed to be something you should feel deep shame about. And this takes us back again to the element of religious faith that has come into SJW ideology, that in a secular world where people want to believe in something, this is the something that they believe in, and it is believed in with all the fervor and certainly at least as much hatefulness as traditional religions have inspired, but yet with none of the benevolence, none of the privileging of forgiveness or understanding or compassion that is an important element in the Judeo-Christian traditions.
Well, in Judeo-Christian tradition, we have this thing, hate the sin, but love the sinner.
Exactly.
Whereas in social justice warriorism, we have love the privilege, hate the privileged, basically.
That's true.
Because
That's
they
very
like
nice.
they like the perks being given to them by privileged, powerful men in governments, in universities, and so on and so forth. They like the privilege, but they just happen to despise the privileged.
Right. They want to have the privilege without ever having to own up to being privileged. Exactly. Yeah. And yeah, the weird parallels and inversions with the notion of original sin are, of course, as you point out, quite striking. Of course, the thing about original sin is that everybody has original sin. It's a wonderful leveling element in the Judeo-Christian tradition, whether you are a monk in a monastery who practices the strictest asceticism, or whether you are a prostitute on the street or whatever it happens to be, or I don't know, a mobster. You all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and everyone has the chance of forgiveness. But in the SJW hierarchy, yeah, it's only certain people who have that sin, and so it's an extreme punitive.
Then comes the intersectionality into the place, and then everyone is some sort of a privileged, because when you get that hierarchical progressive stack, basically then everyone, I mean, they are evolving into this universalist thing. Everyone is privileged in some way, shape, or form, which is in a way closer to reality. On the other hand, it's a good way to basically collapse the entire thing.
Yeah, well, that's true. Although I still think if you're a, black, lesbian, disabled, transgendered, something or other, you're pretty high up there and are fairly immune to criticism. Of course, usually these people are fairly articulate. They're often at university, which means that they're privileged in that way. But that's not a kind of privilege. I mean, the really interesting thing is that all of this comes from Marxism at some level. And yet class is the one real, I think, objective measure of privilege that the social justice warriors don't tend to be very interested in. All of the students protesting at Missouri University, for instance, the leader of that group who went on a hunger strike and they chanted about how all we have to lose is our chains and all of that. It turned out he was the son of millionaire parents, heir to a massive fortune. So, yeah, he's interested in chains, beautiful gold chains, I guess, because he is far more privileged than ordinary students at university. And the people who are doing the worst, as any serious economic study shows, are those who are born and grow up poor, and that is true across racial lines. It has very little to do with, in fact, men are the ones that suffer more than women for a variety of reasons. So, to focus all of the ire on white males is to ignore the fact that many white males are suffering terribly in our economic situation. So yeah, it's really bizarre to me that class, which I think does still need to be addressed as a serious source of lack of privilege, is the one thing that gets ignored.
Yeah, and I guess the final question before we sign off is, how do we promote saner alternatives? Because, for instance, in Britain, recently it has emerged that the worst economic conditions are suffered by working class white men. The most reviled demographic group in Britain is young white men. The worst, the worst success, no, the worst in terms of academic achievement of any kind, including high school, is white boys or white men. It seems to me that these privileged individuals can't even be seen as proper humans. The wall of irrationality continues to prevent the penetration of saner alternatives. And once anyone mentions this, you immediately get called, oh, you're a white nationalist, or no, I'm not. I'm neither of these things. But nonetheless, there is a wall of irrationality that continues to prevent penetration of saner alternatives. How do we get past that, if it is possible?
Yeah. Well, this is it. I mean, how do you get past an irrationality? How do you get past a cultural tendency to dehumanize and to see people who are suffering as less than human and therefore not worthy of compassion? I don't really know. You call out to people to have the courage to stand up for truth. So few people do. There are lots of reasonable people still in positions of power, and there are people in academia who think the entire SJW ideology is stupid, false, and damaging, and yet they won't say a word because of some personal harm, some career damage that may come to them. And these are real career damages. Even if you've got tenure, if you speak out, yeah, you're going to be targeted. You're going to lose opportunities. You're not going to get invited to the conferences. You're not going to get invited to participate in, some book project or whatever. So yes, the harms are going to be real. There are political costs in, whatever sphere of whatever profession you're involved in. But God, I mean, are people really willing to witness the collapse of their culture and to watch the suffering of innocent men go on and on and on simply because they weren't willing to speak out? I just hope that people will find a backbone and will start to change the cultural narrative, as they say. That's the only hope, I think, ultimately. Or, as we've been talking about, collapse. And when that collapse comes, whether it comes in the form of a civil war or just total economic collapse, some kind of massive energy crisis where, people are literally starving and dying in the streets because of the cold, when all those things happen, men will be maybe valued again. The ordinary working class white men will be valued again. They'll also continue to be disposable. They'll be expected to fight in the war and protect women and children, but at least maybe their cultural status would be different. I don't know. That's a pretty gloomy prognosis.
If an energy crisis will emerge, I have a lot more hope for my part of Europe, because in Western Europe, there are large swaths, and by that I mean tens of millions of individuals who simply cannot understand that, the power grid is not a perpetuum mobile. It can stop.
Yeah.
The food coming to your grocery store at the corner of the street we're living in is not a perpetuum mobile. It can stop. Yeah. The reason all of these exist is because men are breaking their backs working for it. And it's amazing how disconnected a significant chunk of the population has become to this particular aspect, that this thin layer of civilization that we have and we enjoy, and it's a fabulous layer, and don't get me wrong, but this thin layer of civilization is fragile. It needs maintenance, constant maintenance. I mean, it's easy to be a feminist writing on Twitter about it, but in order for you to write on Twitter, 1,000 men have to work so the message can be delivered.
Absolutely. And the lack of awareness of that is really startling and amazing. And but unfortunately, I'm going to go down with all those other silly women, because I can't survive either if we get to that point. My husband and I are both not very well equipped to survive. So I hope it doesn't come to that. But if it does, that may be the only thing that allows for another civilization to rebuild.
Mm-hmm. All right. Oh my God. Okay, let's get straight to the London aspect. You're coming to London, right? Have you booked?
I'm coming to London. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Be there. Can't wait.
Yep. For the audience who doesn't know what we're talking about, short reminder: you can see both Professor Janice Fiamengo and myself in person on July the 9th or July the 10th at the International Conference on Men's Issues in London, the United Kingdom. Now, speaking of that, you still have roughly 10 days to get your own tickets at that event. Links to ticket procedures in the low bar, and further details about the lineup of speakers also there. Now, tickets will not be available at the door, so you'd better hurry up and jump at the opportunity by June 4th or 5th. I don't remember exactly when Mike will probably close the sales of those tickets. Remind me again, what are you going to talk about at the conference?
I'm going to talk about feminism in academia and its impacts. That's my subject.
That's going to be a talk that nobody will want to miss. One further reminder: if you have a personal story you want it included in Professor Fiamengo's book, do so by emailing Professor Fiamengo at fiamengo@uottawa.ca. Right? That's Fiamengo at uottawa.ca. Now, the deadline for that is August 31st.
August the 31st. Yes, although that's a flexible deadline. I'm not gonna go ahead until I'm happy with the book. And so if someone wants to contact me and has a really important story to tell but can't meet that deadline, well, we'll make arrangements, but that's the provisional deadline.
Okay. Then anything further to add before we sign up, Professor?
I think that's it.
All right. Then with all of that being said, thank you again, Professor Fiamengo, for coming to the show, and thank you everyone for watching. Cheers.
Bye-bye.